In World War I, the 30th Engineers in the 1st Gas Regiment deployed gas chemical agents in two weapons. The first was the Livens projector. This was a steel gun tube about 8 inches diameter and 6 feet long, and so thin-walled that it had to be buried in the earth before firing, or the propellant charge force would split the tube. A powder charge was placed in the bottom with electrical leads for detonation, followed by a bomb which contained about a gallon of chemical agent. When a row of chemical projectors was set off, the bombs flew across and landed in the enemy lines, creating a massive, unexpected cloud of chemical agent. Unfortunately, the projector couldn't be refired, so the initial concentration frequently dispersed pretty readily. The second weapon was the Stokes mortar. This was a 4-inch mortar, and it could be carried into position and set up quickly by only 2 men, as opposed to the elaborate preparations for the projector. The mortar could fire up to 20 shells a minute, and so although it couldn't achieve the massive initial concentration of the projector, you could sustain a prolonged cloud simply by pumping more shells into the cloud of agent. Freyung was a fortification in the German lines late in the war, so the location was close to the German border. Projectors and mortars were used. A new tactic was popular with the mortars. Instead of being left behind in their static position, they were carried with the forward infantry troops. It was extremely difficult to maintain liaison with the infantry, but somehow they did it, and they fired untold shells of thermite gas and smoke to take out machine gun nests, to block river crossings and wire cuttings, and a whole bunch of other activities that would otherwise have cost many American lives. So now let's take a look at the Battle of Freyung through the eyes of 3 veteran chemical soldiers who were actually there.
World War I and the Battle of Freyung. Shortly after the U.S. entered World War I, the General Staff of the American Expeditionary Force decided to establish a gas service, part of which would be an offensive gas regiment. Born out of this decision was War Department General Order 108, dated 15 August 1917, which authorized and established an offensive gas unit designated as the 30th Engineer Regiment, Gas and Flame. Volunteer troops were accumulated during the fall, during which time the regiment acquired the nickname Hellfire Boys. 4 companies of the regiment departed the United States on Christmas Day 1917 and went into action by March 1918. Companies Echo and Foxtrot were delayed until July and received shorter training periods, but still saw a lot of intense action by the time the war ended on November 11th. On 13 July 1918, the 30th Engineers received a redesignation as the 1st Gas Regiment. Several companies were in action and almost nobody noticed. The unit continued to fire missions until the day before the armistice. All the companies returned to the U.S., and on 28 February 1918, the regiment was deactivated at Camp Kendrick near Lakehurst, New Jersey.
Hello, my name is Sergeant Davis. I'll be playing the role of Master Engineer Senior Grade.
My name is Specialist Johnson, and I'll be playing the part of Corporal Herbert Spriggs.
Hello, my name is Second Lieutenant Lennox Pointer, and I'm playing the part of First Lieutenant Scott Trammell. Are you guys here for Sergeant Kent's memorial service?
I am.
Yes, I am. What about you?
Yes, I am. I'm First Lieutenant Scott Trammell. I don't know if you guys would remember me.
I think I do remember you. From the Battle of Freyung?
Yes, I was there. Where are you all from? And tell me about your experience at Freyung.
I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. My experience in Freya Stallone started when I was seeing an article in the Boston Globe about the Hellfire Boys, a 30th Engineer Regiment.
Yeah, I saw that ad too.
Yeah. I enlisted way back then, and I was a part of the Echo Company where we were supposed to test on chemical weapons, but we didn't have any to train with. So we ended up doing various guard shifts around the installation. But one day, in June 21st, we were able to get, our tents, our bags ready for deployment. We ended up getting on the boat, but the refrigerator unit ended up going out. So we ended up having to wait for 2 weeks for it to get prepared. So that kind of was a bummer for the guys, seeing it in the newspaper that everybody was going, to the war, and we were just there waiting on a refrigerator unit to get fixed. After 2 weeks, the refrigerator unit was fixed, and then we started selling out to France, where we started training on some projectors and some Stokes mortars in defense of chemical attacks. So how was your experience with Freya Stallone? How did it start with you?
So originally I had enlisted from my hometown, which was Eureka, Utah. I went to basic training. It wasn't really around anywhere that anybody knew. There were no identifiable landmarkers anywhere, so I never really knew where I was at. The trainers, they seemed to have a lot of knowledge about how to maintain a rifle. Didn't get much training other than that. And I noticed there was little said about trench warfare because the newspapers, that was all they talked about. So I sailed on a convoy of many ships, probably about 45 ships. All I really remember is the leaning and swaying of the ships. We were going in zigzag formations to throw off the submarines, so they couldn't figure out which way we were going. Next thing you know, we land in France. They sent me to chemical warfare school, which trained me, with gas masks and more chemical stuff. After some weeks, me and about 24 men, we loaded on a couple trucks. For several days, we traveled at night. Not really during the day. We slept during the day. Probably for the last 3 nights, we only traveled at night. So eventually, we reached a fair-sized town, dismounted, and we unloaded our gear. About an hour later, Sergeant and Lieutenant came up without wasting a beat. They said, "Welcome to the 1st Gas Regiment. You will be part of Echo Company." And that's how it all started for me. How about you, sir?
About me, I started off enlisted. I enlisted in 1916, hoping to find some action in Mexico along the border. I remember that the army was growing. The army was getting bigger, and the administrative promoted me to sergeant, and then sent me off to officer candidate school. After being in artillery as an enlisted soldier, I began to find it really boring. I found a newspaper ad talking about recruiting for the Hellfire Boys with the 30th Engineers. I soon put in a paperwork for a transfer, and that brought me to Echo Company, where you guys both were at. I also became platoon XO. Wow, that was my first job in Echo Company. I found myself in the regiment, and I found out Echo Company was sailing to France. The company soon arrived in the small town of Charmont, France. It was I engaged with a lot of platoon leaders when I was there. The platoon leader before me happened to get injured with a phosgene bomb. I don't know if you remember that, but the platoon leader before me happened to get injured. After that, having action for 3 months straight. By the time the company made it to Charnay, October 27th, I was a very seasoned officer by that time. My platoon was assigned to support the 77th Infantry Battalion, acting in the German strongpoint of Freya Stallone.
I remember Freya Stallone. I remember the projectors were set up along the roads, in the bushes, 300 yards away from enemy lines. Those were some hard times, setting that stuff up in the night. And I remember on that one day, my platoon became the first platoon to send an attack. The first wave of infantry people ended up going over top at 0530, and the people that were actually operating the mortars, they ended up staying in position. But a few hours later, we noticed there was an increase in odor and phosgene. So while we was searching, we ended up seeing that our own phosgene bombs were damaged. So Sgt Casey, he ran to the phosgene bomb without no mask, and he carried it off so he could save the team.
Yeah, I remember taking a huge risk carrying the phosgene bomb and taking it and burying it. He probably saved several lives.
Yeah, I remember Sgt Casey. I was detailed to Sgt Casey's platoon. That was like the toughest 3 nights of my life, I remember. We set out over extremely uneven terrain. I remember carrying like 100, maybe over 100 pounds or more. Along the way, we started taking fire, deep rumbles. I remember seeing big flashes of light alongside of the roads. And, I was a little dazed because I had just realized that I had just experienced my first artillery strike. So that was crazy. I'm sure it was for you guys too. So on the 4th night, me and about 20 other soldiers, we found ourselves under Sgt Casey. And at this point in time, in a small forested area, wood line alongside the road, there was a gut-wrenching explosion. A few minutes later, there was tracers coming from machine guns near us, concentrated the area. There was mortar fire. Sgt Casey had yelled for us to get in our holes, so everybody had split and got to the sides of the road in their respective trenches. So it had just seemed like this was going to go on forever. Eventually, by sunrise, Sergeant had called us up to the road, and it seemed that we had been the main point for fire for the past 5 hours. Shortly thereafter, my group passed through the trench line. Runner came up and found Sgt Casey, told him the group had struck off in a new direction. A runner had came up and told Sgt Casey that we had been going in the wrong direction. So after a few hundred yards, infantry lieutenant had linked up with Sergeant Kent to figure out our new direction, our correct azimuth. Meanwhile, the gun crews had been setting up, the mortars and all of our effective fire. And Sergeant Kent yelled out a series of commands right after, very loud and outspoken. He said, "Gun 1 thermite, 4 rounds." I'll remember that term forever.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember when Sergeant Kent sent out, he was yelling out the azimuth, the elevation, and the powder charges to the guns. When the gunners announced ready, he commanded fire. And that was the way it was. You fire your mission, and it's going to happen. You remember the 4th night?
4th night, I do remember the 4th night. So on the 4th night, there was like a assembly of a platoon, I believe, right? And it was in a little town, and that's where you, sir, I remember you from this night. You announced that everybody should get some rest because we were finally going to be going into reserve, and that was a great feeling for me. I found me a nice little haystack, and I went to sleep for the rest of the night.
Yeah, I remember that. That was November 4th. The platoon had reached the town, and 2 guns were in the forest. I do remember that. We did leave 2 guns in the forest, but everybody else was bunkered down in the barn. We remained there until 6 p.m., and then I told the 2 gunners in the forest to come back to the barn. And then early that morning during sunrise, there was a runner that came to us, and his name was, I will never forget his name, Captain Roscoe Dayton. He came to us, and he said that the 77th Division was to go into reserves and echo along with them. And then the Battle of Freyung Stallone was over.
Crazy battle.
I'm a Red Dragon because no one in the Army has the capabilities that I have, nor that my fellow Red Dragons have. Second to none.